If we're going to understand the moment a narcissist realizes you're truly done, we have to begin with a psychological distinction that most people miss. A narcissist is not threatened by conflict. Conflict often reassures them. Anger, pleading, explaining, defending, these are all signs that the emotional cord between you is still intact. As long as you are reacting, they know they can still reach you. What unsettles them is something far quieter. It's the moment your emotional energy changes. Human relationships are not only built on words or actions, they are built on subtle emotional exchanges, tone of voice, eye contact, the urgency behind a message, the way someone leans forward when they speak. These signals communicate far more than we realize. Narcissistic personalities, despite their lack of empathy, are often extremely sensitive to these shifts. They learn, over time, to read emotional reactions the way a trader reads a market. Your distress, your hope, even your frustration, all tell them one thing: you are still invested. The moment you are no longer invested, the entire dynamic changes. At first, the narcissist may not consciously understand what is happening. They may simply notice that something feels different. Your responses are shorter. Your tone carries less intensity. The long explanations stop. You're no longer trying to convince them of your perspective. You're no longer fighting to be understood. And what they sense, often before you even say it out loud, is that something inside you has gone quiet. This quietness is deeply unsettling. For someone whose sense of self relies on emotional control, narcissistic power is not an independent force. It exists only in relationship. It requires engagement. It requires emotional movement. In many ways, it operates like a psychological current. When you argue, the current flows. When you defend yourself, the current flows. Even when you withdraw dramatically or express outrage, the current still flows. But when emotional detachment appears, the current begins to disappear. And that is the moment the narcissist starts to feel something they rarely tolerate. Well, uncertainty. Because what they depend on, often unconsciously, is the ability to provoke you. If they can make you angry, they know they still matter. If they can make you cry, they know they still have access to your emotional world. If they can make you explain yourself again and again, they know you are still seeking something from them. But indifference sends a very different message. Indifference says, you no longer have authority in my inner world. And psychologically, that is far more destabilizing than anger. Anger still acknowledges importance. Indifference quietly removes it. This is why many people are surprised by what happens next. They imagine that the narcissist will react most strongly to confrontation, to accusations, to emotional declarations of independence. Yet very often, the moment that truly alarms them is far more subtle. It's when you stop trying, when you stop correcting their distortions, when you stop chasing resolution, when you stop needing them to see your pain. Because in that moment, something becomes clear to them in a way that words could never communicate. The emotional door they once walked through so easily is beginning to close. And when a narcissist senses that door closing, they understand something that threatens the entire structure of their control. For the first time, they are no longer influencing your emotional reality. And that realization marks the very beginning of the moment they fear most, the moment they recognize they may have already lost you. Once the narcissist senses that you are emotionally detached, their reaction often surprises those who have been entangled with them for years. You might expect anger, threats, or withdrawal. But more often, the first response is something far more insidious. Sudden charm. A calm voice, careful words, a seeming reflection of self-awareness. They may speak of regret, of lessons learned, of how they see the pain they've caused. And if you are not careful, it can feel almost convincing. But it is important to understand that this is not a moment of genuine transformation. It is a calculated strategy. It is their first attempt to regain the influence they have lost. What is fascinating and deeply revealing about narcissistic behavior is that they are acutely aware of timing and perception. They have spent a lifetime observing how people respond to them, cataloging which words, which gestures, which appeals stir the desired effect. When they sense detachment, there is a sudden need to recalibrate. Charm becomes a tool because they know that emotional softness, or the appearance of accountability, can pull you back into the current they desperately want flowing again. It is, in essence, a psychological bait. And it works because it plays on the very hope that has kept you engaged, the hope that they might change. Yet beneath this veneer lies a quiet tension. Narcissists operate in a constant tension between self-image and reality. The persona they project is carefully constructed to ensure admiration, attention, or at least compliance. When you detach, they encounter a reality that does not bend to their design. The calm, reflective behavior is an attempt to manage this dissonance, to project control even as they feel it slipping. The charm is a calculated mask, and often it is in these moments that you see their most subtle forms of manipulation emerge. Tasked, they are not seeking understanding. They are seeking an opening. This is why it is so easy to misread them at this stage. Someone unfamiliar with narcissistic dynamics might interpret this sudden softness as empathy, as remorse, or even as love, but a careful examination of the pattern reveals the truth. The change is context-dependent. Tit appears only when it serves the narcissist's agenda. The detachment you exhibit triggers it. The moment you are no longer emotionally available, they adjust their strategy. It is reactive, not transformative. The charm is never an invitation to reconciliation. It is a test. Will you respond? Will you re-engage? Do you once again feed the current that sustains their sense of self? And here lies a critical psychological insight. Narcissists rarely reflect on their behavior in the way a non-narcissistic person might. Their self-awareness is selective and strategic. They may speak of lessons learned, but these lessons are not about ethical growth. They are lessons in influence, how to regain what has been lost, how to restore attention, how to reverse your emotional departure. The words are carefully chosen to create the illusion of introspection, but the underlying intent is instrumental. Their awareness is functional, designed to achieve a specific outcome. For anyone observing or experiencing this, it is crucial to recognize the subtle difference between apparent reflection and strategic maneuvering. True change manifests consistently across contexts over time. What the narcissist offers in these moments is a momentary adaptation, a final attempt to regain what you have withdrawn. But so, regain what you have withdrawn. Tit is a mirror held up to your own attention, a reflection of the power you once granted them and the power you are now reclaiming. The essential truth is this: charm in the face of detachment is never innocence. It is strategy. It is a signal that they recognize the shift, that they understand the loss of control, and that they are taking calculated steps to regain it. And once you see this, once you understand the mechanics behind the calm and the apology, the choice becomes clear. You are no longer responding to a person who is capable of growth. You are responding to a mechanism designed to ensnare you again. And in seeing this clearly, you reclaim the terse measure of freedom, the freedom to choose silence, the freedom to disengage, and the freedom to disengage, and the freedom to refuse the bait, even as it gleams before you. Once the narcissist realizes that their first attempts at charm or false reflection are failing, they escalate. This is when what psychologists call hoovering often begins, a term that evokes the idea of sucking back in, of retrieving what has been lost. Hoovering is not just a series of messages, calls, or encounters. It is a strategic, almost surgical attempt to reopen the emotional connection that they now recognize is slipping from their grasp. Every word, every memory they invoke is carefully chosen to provoke a response, to reignite the currents of attention that once sustained them. What is remarkable about hoovering is how it mirrors the same psychological tactics that kept you enmeshed in the first place. It often begins subtly. A text appears that references something intimate, something only you two shared. A memory is invoked, one that carries warmth or nostalgia. Sometimes it is a practical appeal, a request for help, for information, for collaboration. The surface may seem innocent, even reasonable, but the underlying intent is always the same: to reestablish influence. Hoovering is less about reconciliation than it is about reactivation. They want to see your emotional presence once more to measure whether the detachment you have cultivated is truly permanent or still negotiable. At its core, hoovering is a reflection of the narcissist's dependency on external validation. For a person with narcissistic tendencies, identity is often relational rather than intrinsic. Define themselves, consciously or unconsciously, by the responses they elicit. When you withdraw, the internal framework they have built to maintain their sense of self begins to wobble. Hoovering is an instinctive, almost primal attempt to stabilize that structure. They are attempting to bring you back into their orbit, not because of genuine care or remorse, but because their psychological equilibrium demands it. Yet there is a subtle paradox here. The very act of hoovering exposes their fear. The more elaborate or insistent their attempts, the more you can see the fragile scaffolding beneath their persona. The messages that arrive with seemingly casual warmth often carry undercurrents of urgency. The memories they evoke, the promises they attempt to resurrect, all signal a mind increasingly aware that the current of emotional control is running dry. Hoovering is not a confident act. It is a response to the threat of permanent loss. Understanding this gives us a crucial insight into human behavior. The narcissist's need to hoover is not merely malicious. It is symptomatic of a deeper psychological reality. Their sense of self is contingent, and detachment from those they once controlled creates an existential threat. When you refuse to respond, when you resist the invitation to re-engage, you are confronting a person who has rarely, if ever, faced the void of indifference. Their strategies may intensify, but the underlying truth is that each attempt to pull you back is also an acknowledgement of their vulnerability. This is why it is essential to recognize the subtlety of hoovering. It is rarely blatant. It may come as a single message after months of silence, or as an indirect reference in a social setting. It may appear as concern, as apology, or as a seemingly casual check-in. Its genius lies in its ability to provoke thought, nostalgia, or guilt without overt coercion. And yet, the response it seeks is always the same. Engagement. It wants your presence, your attention, your acknowledgement. And if you resist, if you maintain your boundaries, it cannot succeed. In this sense, the hoovering, taste, becomes a mirror of your own resilience. It tests whether you have internalized the detachment necessary to preserve your autonomy. It challenges your capacity to remain emotionally grounded in the face of a carefully engineered enticement. And when you withstand it, when you observe the strategy for what it is, without reacting, you reclaim not only your freedom, but also the power that the narcissist sought to take from you. The true measure of victory in these moments is subtle but profound. You are no longer participating in their cycle. The hoovering fails because your attention, once a currency of their control, is no longer available. In resisting the pull, you make the first irreversible claim over your own emotional sovereignty. Once the narcissist has exhausted the first layers of charm and hoovering, there comes a critical turning point, a moment of stark realization. This is when they begin to understand, often in a way that feels almost tangible to them, that their usual tactics are failing. You are no longer reacting in ways that sustain their sense of control. The emotional currents that once defined their influence have quieted. And in that quiet, a very particular kind of psychological crisis begins to take shape. For a narcissist, influence is not just power, it is identity. Their self-worth, their perception of reality, is inseparable from the responses of others. Without engagement, without attention, even negative attention, they lose the scaffolding upon which their sense of self has been constructed. This is why detachment hits them harder than anger or confrontation ever could. Do you argue when you plead? When you react, you are paradoxically still giving them life. You are acknowledging them, confirming their relevance. But when you step away, when you no longer respond, you are not just refusing to be controlled. You are exposing a gap in the very architecture of their self-conception. This realization often triggers a subtle but profound internal collapse. It is rarely dramatic at first. They may try to reinterpret your actions to convince themselves that you will return or that you are simply testing them. But each unanswered message, each ignored attempt at engagement, chips away at the narrative they rely upon. The narcissist begins to confront a reality they are structurally unequipped to handle, a world in which their usual strategies of manipulation, persuasion, and emotional coercion no longer suffice. And here is the paradox. The closer you are to emotional independence, the more destabilized they become. You may think that by cutting off communication, by withdrawing your attention, you are simply enforcing boundaries, and you are. But you are also creating a mirror in which they see themselves for the first time without the feedback loops they have depended on. The very strategies that once ensured their dominance now fail to operate, and with each failure, their internal anxiety intensifies. This stage often brings out the darkest, most defensive impulses. Some narcissists attempt to rewrite reality, spreading rumors or projecting blame onto you. Others may escalate their hoovering, creating elaborate scenarios intended to provoke a response. At its core, this behavior is less about you and more about their confrontation with loss, the loss of control, the loss of attention, the loss of identity itself. Your detachment exposes their dependency, and dependency, when unacknowledged, manifests as rage, despair, or subtle, insidious attempts at revenge. Yet in this moment of understanding, there is also clarity. When you see a narcissist at the edge of this realization, you recognize the truth of human relational dynamics. Their power was never inherent. It was always relational. It depended on your engagement, your attention, your emotional energy, and once those elements are no longer available, their influence begins to crumble, leaving only the raw, exposed psychology beneath. For you, the lesson is profound. Maintaining detachment is not an act of cruelty. It is an assertion of sovereignty. It demonstrates that your emotional world cannot be hijacked, that the currents of manipulation no longer dictate your inner state. And for the narcissist, this is the moment of deepest vulnerability, a moment when they recognize, with a clarity they rarely tolerate, that the control they believed was theirs has quietly, irreversibly slipped through their fingers. The essential truth is this: influence is never absolute. Power that depends on another's engagement is fragile. And when you refuse to participate in the drama, when you hold steady in your detachment, you teach a lesson far more profound than any argument or confrontation ever could. The only power they truly had was the power you allowed them to have, and that power is now gone. Time, when the narcissist reaches the point where all direct attempts at influence fail, their response often shifts in ways that are far darker, far more insidious. This is the stage where their strategies move from trying to reclaim your attention to attempting to control perception itself. When they can no longer manipulate you directly, they try to manipulate the world around you. This is what we call the dirtiest final move. A calculated effort to redefine reality in their favor, to rewrite the narrative of your departure so that it reflects not your autonomy, but their version of events. It often begins subtly. Stories are whispered, casual remarks are made, questions are framed in ways that cast doubt on your character. They reframe the situation so that your decision to leave becomes evidence of betrayal, immaturity, or instability. And because their words are often delivered outside your presence, they gain power precisely by avoiding confrontation. The truth of your experience is obscured, replaced with a carefully constructed image that serves their self-interest. It is not enough for them that you leave. They cannot bear to lose the psychological control they have long relied upon, so they extend the battlefield into the perceptions of others. This final move is deeply rooted in the narcissist's psychology. They live in a world where self-image is paramount, and external validation is the foundation of their identity. When you detach, you threaten that identity in the most profound way. You become a mirror reflecting the inadequacy, the fragility, the unacknowledged failures that they cannot tolerate. And because they cannot confront these truths internally, they project them outward. By attacking your reputation or rewriting your story, they attempt to externalize the conflict, shifting the focus away from their own shortcomings and onto yours. It is important to understand the subtlety of this behavior. The attacks are rarely overt, rarely direct. They manifest in half-truths, insinuations, or selective framing of events. Someone observing from the outside may see only ordinary disagreements or misunderstandings, and yet the impact is profound. The narcissist's goal is not just to cause harm, it is to destabilize your social and emotional reality, to make your independence feel unsafe, to provoke a response that can be fed back into their sense of control. They are attempting to turn the world against you, to create an emotional environment where they remain central, even in your absence. At a deeper level, this behavior exposes a critical truth about human relationships and power. Influence that is maintained through fear, manipulation, or deception is never secure. It depends on the compliance of others, on their engagement with the narratives you construct. times and the narcissist can no longer command your attention or emotional energy, the fragility of this power becomes visible. Their dirtiest move is an attempt to mask that fragility, to assert dominance in the only arena still accessible to them, perception. And yet, as difficult as this stage can be, it also contains a profound opportunity for clarity. When you recognize these tactics for what they are, you see the limitations of narcissistic control. You understand that their attacks on reputation, their attempts to rewrite reality, are not a reflection of your truth, but of their fear. Their identity, so dependent on validation, cannot survive the quiet absence of your engagement. And every insinuation, every half-truth, is a desperate acknowledgement of loss. For those who maintain detachment, this final move becomes less threatening and more revealing, teaches a lesson about boundaries, about the power inherent in refusal, about the psychological independence that cannot be stolen. And it underscores the essential insight that the narcissist's power was never autonomous. It existed only in relationship, only in the emotional and social space you once occupied. The critical truth is this: when they attempt their dirtiest final move, it is the shadow of their own fear projected outward. Their stories, their insinuations, their manipulations are reflections of their loss, not your failure. We use Kongs of their loss, not your failure. And when you refuse to engage, when you protect your inner reality, you transform their final act of control into an empty gesture. It is then that the narcissist's power truly collapses, leaving only the exposed vulnerability they have so long hidden behind masks. At this stage, the narcissist's strategies become even more revealing, not just of their desire for control, but of profound vulnerabilities that underpin their very sense of self. When you have withdrawn fully, when your detachment has resisted charm, hoovering, and subtle manipulations, something deeper emerges in their behavior, projection, to what they cannot acknowledge within themselves. Shame, guilt, inadequacy, they cast outward onto you. And this projection is not merely a defensive maneuver, it is an unconscious attempt to protect an identity that is fundamentally fragile. Narcissists live in a paradoxical psychological space. On one hand, they project an image of invulnerability, confidence, and control. On the other, their self-concept is remarkably contingent on the validation, attention, and emotional engagement of others. Every compliment, every reaction, every acknowledgement acts as a scaffolding for their sense of worth. And when you detach, when your emotional energy no longer feeds that scaffolding, the structure begins to tremble. The internal dissonance between the self they claim to be and the reality they cannot face becomes intolerable. Projection emerges as a way to manage that dissonance. Projection operates subtly, often masquerading as observation, critique, or concern. They accuse you of behaviors or intentions that, in truth, reflect their own patterns. They frame your choices as betrayals, selfishness, or malice, even as these very qualities were manifested by them. By externalizing these traits, they attempt to avoid confronting the shame that arises from recognizing their own moral and emotional failings. In effect, they are trying to convince both you and themselves that the problem lies not in them, but in the one who has had the courage to step away. This is why the narcissist's final moves often feel disorienting and deeply personal. Do you know yourself? You have clarity about your intentions, your boundaries, your choices. Yet the narrative they can feel dissonant, almost as if reality itself is shifting. That is the power of projection. That is the power of projection. It is a psychological smokescreen designed to protect a self-image that cannot tolerate reflection. The accusations, the distortions, even the subtle insinuations are all attempts to stabilize a fragile ego by deflecting the internal discomfort outward. At the same time, projection is revealing. It exposes the very traits and vulnerabilities that they cannot integrate. The anger, the accusations, the attempts to rewrite reality, they are not evidence of your shortcomings. They are a mirror of their unacknowledged shame. The more vehement the projection, the more intense the internal conflict they are attempting to suppress. In a sense, projection is a window into the psychic architecture of narcissism, the unprocessed shame that fuels manipulation, the fear of exposure that drives charm and hoovering, the relentless need for validation that underpins every interaction. Twofold. First, understanding projection allows you to interpret their behavior not as an accurate reflection of your reality, but as a manifestation of their reality, but as a manifestation of their unresolved inner turmoil. Recognizing this distinction frees you from the illusion that their accusations carry truth about your character. Second, projection underscores the importance of detachment. When you refuse to participate in the narratives they construct, when you do not internalize their projections, you deny them the power they crave. You are no longer a stage for their shame, no longer a vessel for their unresolved pain. In this way, projection is both a final attack and a subtle revelation. It is a measure of the narcissist's dependency on relational validation, a signal of the shame they cannot face, and a reflection of the psychological liberation you have achieved. Their efforts to deflect, accuse, and distort are ultimately powerless against the clarity of detachment. The essential truth is this. When the narcissist projects their own shame onto you, it is not a statement about your worth. It is an exposure of their vulnerability. It is an exposure of their vulnerability. And when you remain steady, refusing to absorb the projections, you assert a profound and irreversible truth. Their shadow can no longer touch the light of your autonomy. At the end of this journey, after charm, hoovering, manipulation, projection, and every attempt at control has failed, there remains one final decisive element. One that is as quiet as it is powerful, your silence. It is the most unsettling thing a narcissist can encounter because it cannot be controlled, argued with, or manipulated. Every tactic they have relied upon, from seduction to subtle intimidation, depends on engagement. When you withhold that engagement, when you step fully into your own inner autonomy, you dismantle their power in a way that is absolute and irreversible. Silence is not passive. It is not inaction. It is the deliberate, conscious refusal to participate in the psychological theater they have constructed. Narcissists exist in a relational reality where attention is currency. They measure significance by the emotional energy they elicit from others. Anger, outrage, fear, even love, these all feed the structure of their identity. Without a response, their world becomes a void. And in that void, the mechanisms that sustain their self-image begin to collapse. This is why silence can feel so threatening to them. It is not the words you say, nor the confrontations you initiate that unmoor them. It is the absence of the very thing they have always counted on. Your detachment strips away the validation they relied upon. Your refusal to engage interrupts the patterns of cause and effect they expect, and in that interruption, you are no longer a participant in their story. You are outside it entirely. For the first time, they confront a reality in which they do not hold influence. The beauty of silence is that it does not provoke defensiveness in you. It provokes confrontation in them. They may attempt to fill it, to interpret it, to assign meaning where there is none. They may hoover one last time, escalate manipulation, or lash out in subtle or overt ways. And yet, none of these efforts can succeed if you maintain your grounded presence. Each unreturned message, each unacknowledged provocation becomes a silent declaration of independence. It communicates the boundaries you have established without needing explanation or justification. Psychologically, this stage represents a profound reversal of power. For years, the narcissist relied on your attention to define their reality. They fed on your emotional responsiveness, your need for resolution, your willingness to engage. In refusing to provide these, you demonstrate something they rarely encounter. A person whose sense of self does not depend on their validation. In that demonstration, their influence evaporates, not through confrontation, not through exposure, but simply through your unwavering presence in your own inner world. There is also a deeper philosophical dimension to this silence. In withdrawing from the relational dynamics of manipulation, you are reclaiming the authority over your own mind and emotions. You are asserting that your inner life is your own, that it cannot be commandeered, and that no one has the right to distort it for their own gain. The narcissist's attempts to dominate your narrative, to rewrite reality, or to project shame onto you are rendered impotent. Silence is both shield and sword. It protects you while dismantling the very mechanisms of control. This is where the ultimate truth becomes clear. The narcissist's power is not inherent. It is entirely relational. They cannot exist psychologically without the engagement of others. Your silence demonstrates this in its purest form. It is the ultimate act of non-cooperation, the quiet but devastating refusal to participate in their manipulation. In that refusal, the narcissist encounters a reality they cannot manage, a loss they cannot reverse, and a freedom they cannot touch. The power of silence lies in its simplicity. It does not provoke retaliation. It does not seek revenge, and it does not attempt to explain or justify. It simply exists. And in existing, it communicates the most profound truth of all. The only power they ever had was the power you allowed them to have. And that power, once withdrawn, is gone forever. Silence, in the end, is not absence. It is presence in its most liberated form. It is the final act that no charm, no hovering, no manipulation, and no projection can ever undo. And it is in this presence, steady and unyielding, that the narcissist's grip dissolves completely, leaving you whole, autonomous, and free.